We've talked previously about the role that social workers have in providing macro interventions as opposed to micro interventions. And while this is a class that is focused upon practice with individuals, nonetheless, macro interventions play a part in that practice as well, because oftentimes uh, our roles will require us to step outside of the relationship, the direct treatment relationship, and to advocate on behalf of our clients with various systems in their lives. And so this particular chapter is most of Hepworth's look at macro interventions and resource development and advocacy and the considerations that are involved in that. Now, the history of social work macro interventions really go back into the 1800s and the influence of Jane Addams, who was a young, really upper class woman who was educated in England and became familiar with interventions in England that had a macro focus, that is, in helping clients deal with the difficulties in their environment. And uh, she brought that method of intervention back to the States and established, well, the first settlement house in the United States was Hull House in Chicago, as you probably know, and out of that, the settlement house movement began in the late 1800s. Now, the social work profession more or less abandoned this particular approach to social work in the early 1900s with the rise of socialism around the world and the difficulties that we were having in the United States with the economy at the time. There was a high rate of unemployment, and there were conflicts between employers and workers. If you read The Jungle, this took place during this period of time. And out of this, the social work profession and their efforts to create social change and societal change in the public's mind very much began to become connected with the socialist movement and eventually communism. And so, in order to establish the profession itself, it appears as though what we did was we began to develop our profession around the casework approach, the individual treatment approach. Mary Richmond's first social work text, Social Diagnosis, as I recall, really was about casework, and the profession kind of found more safety and acceptance publicly by really working with individuals to change the individual to fit better into society. That was less threatening overall, I think, to the public. And so the settlement house movement and the whole idea of social advocacy as the preferred mode of social intervention really was set aside. Now, social advocacy, of course, has continued to exist throughout this time, but well, for instance, if as a professional social worker you're looking to earn a living and have a decent salary, you're going to find that even still today, you're not going to get as much um, financial compensation for working in agencies that provide more macro interventions in the community than you will in providing individual treatment. And that's just a fact of the profession at this time. And I think that reflects our switch to the casework model, really the medical model of intervention 100 years ago. And so, in any event, we still want to advocate for our clients, and there still is um, the I think the social work profession as a whole and NASW organization really does a lot to keep focus upon social action and advocacy for clients, and through that can enlist us in providing the same kind of services for our clients, even in the context of individual treatment. So, macro practice involves professionally guided interventions that address the social problems and conditions that impact our clients. There are different kinds of theories and perspectives that come into play with macro practice. Systems theory is something that I think is very important to understand. Systems theory really has to do with the impact of of the systems that in which your client exists. So the family system, the community, the larger society, those kinds of systems, and how those groups and those communities impact the individual, and how the individual impacts those larger systems as well. Conflict theory talks about the tensions between the different subsystems and larger systems that revolve around power, particularly power as it impacts the marginalized populations, let's say. This conflict theory grows out of Marxist theory, again, that you see that where some of the connection to socialism and communism in the public's mind is developed in regards to social work profession, but conflict theory really develops out of Marxism, Marxist theory that essentially the capitalists, the ones that are in power, do all they can to maintain their power, and that ultimately the workers have to collectively challenge the power of the owner. And this predicts that there's a conflict between the workers and the industrialists and all of that. But nonetheless, it really talks about the competition that exists between the wealthy and the marginalized populations, and identifies that resources essentially are limited, and so different groups have to compete for those limited resources. In the years that I was teaching sociology at KPC, in addition to my human services social work courses, I became more familiar with conflict theory, and it is the perspective in sociology that I think makes the most sense in so many respects. How it is that power uses the power it has to maintain its position and to keep the masses, so to speak, those out of power, in their proper place. So obviously in macro intervention, you're working on behalf of the oppressed and the marginalized populations in addressing issues of need with the larger organizations that are in control. Human agency theory is also something, of course, this really addresses the capacity of groups and communities, individuals as well, to be active participants in a collective action that increases their power to address inequalities and injustices in society. What can we do as workers to improve our clients and the communities in which they live, their sense of self-efficacy, so that they can impact and create change themselves where problems exist in a society that they live in. Social justice theory is also, of course, very important. Social justice theory calls for equality and fairness in accessing resources and in the distribution of those resources and opportunity. And of course, social justice is one of those basic principles in our social work code of ethics, and underlies a lot of what we do in social work. Power and powerlessness are linked to the experience of inequality, and so this again goes back to conflict theory. I think one of the things that we do then as workers, as we work with individuals, is to help those individuals and those groups that we work with to find ways to be empowered and to overcome the inequalities that exist in their lives. This may involve getting people together and helping them discover their own strengths and increasing their empowerment as a group. And this can be very critical in helping them to develop the self-efficacy they need to challenge the systems that are holding them down. Of course, how we go about doing that depends a lot upon what the context is of the situation, what the target is, whether it's an agency or a particular policy of an agency, whether it's a larger government issue or a legislative issue, or simply addressing the administration of a school system. So we have to identify what the goal is, and then the strategy really develops out of that context. So of course, it does require skills in being able to identify problems and in finding effective ways to address those particular problems. And so there are some assessment questions that are proposed here in general, that we try to determine the nature of the condition or the problem that needs changed, where the responsibility lies for the problem or the condition, what those social justice concerns are related to that particular problem or condition, and also addressing the different perspectives of social justice. So Hepworth talks about the thing such as social distance, for instance, that agency administrators become very, very removed from the conditions of their clients, so that what goes on in the day-to-day lives of clients are something that's very remote to the consciousness of those individuals who are developing policy that is intended to address the needs of that population. That's the social distance they're talking about, and finding ways to overcome that, overcoming the power differentials, addressing differences in ideological contexts, and those kinds of things are part of this, the assessment of what it is that needs to happen. You'll see these particular questions repeat themselves as we go through the slides, but in slightly different ways. So one of the things we're going to do then in a macro approach is to develop the resources that exist in the community. Sometimes this involves educating people about the social conditions in which they live. I think the reality of life sometimes is such that individuals don't always recognize their own oppression. And it's also true that individuals that are in positions of power don't recognize their own privilege and the power that they have at times. And so the education process, I think, involves educating both ends of that particular spectrum in terms of their relative position in this problem. So we have to determine and document the needs that exist in the particular community, their particular clients' lives, and again, Hepworth talks about different kinds of needs. A normative need is sort of a discrepancy between a need that's considered to be normal, things that we should all have access to, and the resources that exist to respond to that need. And Hepworth, I think, talks about having green spaces for kids, parks and playgrounds and things like that. These are things that are considered to be, typical for and expected for any child in normal development and things like that. Yet some children don't have that, so that's a normative need. Whereas a demand need might mean affordable housing or affordable foodstuffs and those kinds of things, where there are needs of a particular group that have a particular concern for their situation. Just that there are different types of needs, and also that are going to affect how we approach addressing those problems. This slide talks about doing your research before you go in, basically, into the community over to try to bring about change. And one of the things it stresses is that we identify the stakeholders that are involved in the particular problem and engage them in controlling the intervention and participating in it actively throughout the life of the project. So again, Hepworth talks about, I think, about homelessness, and if you're going to address that problem, one of the things you need to do is to get some of that population engaged in discussing the problem and in trying to brainstorm and find ways to go about resolving the issue. Sometimes they talk about, that the group sometimes has individuals that they can be very helpful, so that they call them, referred to as key informants. These are individuals who can tell you what's going on with the group and can report the kinds of conditions and needs that exist that need to be resolved, whereas others in the group may not be so helpful. Cultural interpreters that as a part of your own approach into a group that you're not familiar with or whatever, you're not a part of, that someone who can help you understand what's going on and correct any misperceptions you have about the particular population, so that you really get to know what the needs of that group are. Case advocacy really is working on behalf of one particular client to overcome and resolve some of the issues that they have to deal with, and help them find ways to be more effective in having their needs met. Whereas cause advocacy is a larger issue, I think, that has more to do with a community and a society and altering some of the basic structures of that, of their existence, so that systems of oppression are eliminated. So you might be working on behalf of clients to ensure that they receive the benefits they're entitled to. You might advocate for welfare clients, with their landlords, for instance, if the landlords are not being responsive to the needs of the housing where they live. You might address at a larger level the effects of legislation and policies, or you might be engaged in political action. Political action for candidate election PACE. So the NASW has a PACE organization that they often, if you're a member, they'll ask you for extra donations for their PACE projects, where they support candidates that are going to be supportive of social causes and policies that will affect our constituents and our practice and our ability to do the work that we need to do. Social action and advocacy involves obtaining services or resources that wouldn't otherwise be provided for those individuals or for a particular group, or to modify or influence the policies and practices that have a negative impact upon our clients or the communities in which they live, and to promote legislation or policies that will result in the provision of required resources or services. So advocacy and social action, I think, together are in many respects one and the same thing, although there are some distinctions between them. How do you know when social action or advocacy is indicated? Here are some conditions that might suggest that it's needed, such as benefits being denied to a group or a community or to a particular client, again, that is otherwise eligible for those benefits. If you see practices that are dehumanizing or confrontational, coercive, discrimination based on race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, culture, or other factors that impact minority populations of one kind or another. Gaps in benefits that cause undue hardships. People who don't participate in decisions that affect their own lives is another area for social action, where you actually are working with the individuals there to kind of help them become more effective, to improve their self-efficacy. You might address agency policies. You might address basic human and civil rights and those kinds of things. So there's a whole number of different kinds of things there, and there are others. These are just some examples of cues you might have that social action is necessary on behalf of your client. Your ability to pursue those causes sometimes are limited by your role in the agency, I would add, and in whatever agency you're working for. Legal aid services were a very, very big thing in the mid 1960s. Legal aid societies were being established all over the United States. This was during the grandeur of the civil rights legislation during the Johnson administrations in particular. And legal aid offices were set up, government-funded, federal agencies actually funded to provide legal services to individuals who couldn't afford to do that, and the idea being that the attorneys would help them sue landlords, for instance, that weren't taking care of property properly, for instance, or to confront agencies that were denying benefits to clients that should have been eligible for those benefits, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, over the years, I may have mentioned this in an earlier talk, that these agencies eventually became defunded by the federal government, because the federal government was discovering that most of the legal actions that were being taken on behalf of the clients were against the federal government itself, and so the feds, I think, just kind of reached the decision that they were kind of shooting themselves in the foot with this, sadly, with this particular service, and so legal aid was defunded. Now there are local legal aid organizations and societies there today. They're fairly limited in terms of what they'll represent clients for and those kinds of things. But they're funded, I think, more by local governments and those kinds of things. It's not the large program that it was back in the 60s. And so again, you have to kind of look and see whether or not advocacy can fit into your role, and if if your agency doesn't permit that for whatever reason, um, then perhaps what you need to do is to refer your client to someone who can provide those kinds of services when they're necessary. I think in most cases, though, there's a lot of different ways we can advocate for our clients, um, if not on a larger scale like that, at least on a smaller scale with our agency administrators and that type of thing, as well as advocating for clients with the various systems that are perhaps mistreating them or oppressing them. You do have to have some skills for social action to be effective at it, and this includes, the ability to analyze policy, the ability to facilitate group interactions, to have good oral and written communication skills, to be able to negotiate and mediate, and to really to analyze all the different dimensions of the information, the different dimensions of the problem and the information that's needed to resolve those problems. And of course, what ethically speaking, when you engage in social action or advocacy on behalf of a client or a client group, it's very important that you discuss the barriers and the possible negative consequences of that advocacy, so that well, first of all, they're informed participants in it, and they decide that the negative consequences, for instance, are something they can live with. In exchange for some improvement in their condition. So it's always important to be able to discuss that honestly with your client system and be sure they understand what you're going to do and how it may impact them. Recently there was a campaign to remove a judge from office after a very well most everyone that I know believes a very, very poor decision in terms of handling of a sex offender case, and some individuals who were involved in coordinating that campaign experienced quite a bit of negative comments through social media and things like that I think were pretty difficult at different times, but nonetheless, continued with their advocacy, for this judge's removal, and wound up being successful in that, by the way. But sometimes advocacy certainly puts the worker, puts the clients groups in difficult situations, something always to be considered. And of course, again, going back to the conflict perspective, those in power, those who have the power, are going to do all they can to keep those out of power in their place, and so that those negative consequences have to do with power responding to the challenges from below. So in order, if you're going to go about social action, then you want to first assess and document the problem or the condition. This is where I told you that this particular kind of format would repeat a couple of times in this lecture, and here it is again, where you begin by assessing and documenting the problem. You gather information and analyze that information about the thing that's to be changed. You assess both the driving forces that may promote change and the forces that may inhibit change. So anticipate the things that are going to help you bring about those change, and also the barriers that you're going to encounter in the process of trying to create that change. You're going to engage the client group itself in identifying goals and make sure that you understand all of the viewpoints of the individuals within the client group. Develop strategies that match the outcome to make sure that what you're going to do is going to lead to the desired outcome, and have a reasonable schedule for implementing your plan of action. And then finally, make sure that there's a feedback process that allows you to evaluate the effectiveness of your advocacy. If you're working to change an organizational environment, there are different kinds of concepts that are useful to be aware of in doing so. So think about this maybe in terms of working at an agency, and you want to change the culture of your agency, or you want to even change the policies of the agency, and so that it is more effective in providing appropriate service to your clients. Uh, you want to look at, for instance, the style of learning in the organization. There is such a thing as a learning organization and this is something maybe you want to try to encourage administration to develop, which is this tendency to review performance, the agency's performance, the organization's performance from time to time, and to make the adjustments that are necessary to improve services to clients and to achieve the goals of the organization. This is something that I think successful business organizations do routinely. They're always kind of looking and perhaps they have corporations, for instance, have to report to stockholders about their level of profits and things like this. Now, of course, in a social service organization, generally speaking, you're not going to be looking at things like profits. You're going to be looking at client outcomes. So it kind of develop the same mentality where you may not be reporting to the stockholders, but you're essentially reporting to clients perhaps about how you're doing as an organization and in expressing or addressing their concerns. Staff members are agents of change in organizations. They're the people that are on the street, as Hepworth refers to, and perhaps can close some of that that distance, that social distance that was referred to earlier between policy makers and policy recipients. So that they're the people, the staff, the line staff, if you want to call it that, in a residential facility, or the frontline staff, if in most agencies, they're the individuals that know what's going on with their clients, and so engaging them in this process is something that's very important. But at the same time, they should also be aware of the risks and the benefits of those changes. And again, that includes the risk to self as a professional as well, whether it involves some possibility of some type of retribution from administration for advocating for change, or whether it has any number of different things that might occur. It's best to describe and document the issue before you initiate a change effort, and that includes understanding the context of the issue. Have a proposal ready to remedy the problem, and to be able to describe the benefits that are expected as far as the organizational functioning. If you're going to try to advocate for change with an organization and administration, one way to catch the ear of the administration, I think, is to speak in terms of organizational functioning and how this will help the agency, for instance, not only the client, which should be the primary concern, but sometimes, again, for administrators, the bottom line is what is most efficient in terms of the provision of service. And so think about that as well. Do a cost-benefit analysis about these strategies for change, so that you're ready to counter any kind of negative reactions to the change. And of course, this last statement, that the leadership and the resource environment have a lot to do with the culture and the environment of the organization as a whole. The kind of supervision, the kind of leadership, and the things that they stress are the things that really kind of establish the culture of the organization. And so well, I guess it's just useful to keep that in mind and to understand that as you go about trying to address the particular problems within an organization that you wish to change. So in engaging in organizational change, you want to evaluate the impact of the policies, procedures, and practice on service delivery. Positive staff behavior is essential to maintaining an organizational environment, and this means that the culture of your organization should be one that cultivates a respect for client dignity and worth. Racism and discrimination are embedded, as this says, in the fabric of society to such an extent that a lot of times we don't recognize that it's there. It's easy sometimes to overlook it or miss it. And as I said earlier, as well as it's easy to not catch on to the fact that the privilege that we have, in our particular position as well. And so we don't always understand the impact, the manifestations of racism and discrimination in everyday life. Um, I refer you back to an article I think I posted in assignments early in the semester, and one that you probably are familiar with from before, but Peggy McIntosh's article on the knapsack of privilege, I believe it's called, and she talks about white privilege there, and there are, I think, in the full list of privileges, something like 57 different privileges that are very, very subtle, and this is what it says here a lot of times, that these the kinds of oppression, the kinds of discrimination, the kind of privilege that individuals experience are really so subtle sometimes that they're not even recognized. And I think that article does a beautiful job of demonstrating how that can be. So this indirect, direct, or subtle institutionalized racism, which exists in all sorts of our institutions in our society, then um, they lead to the disparate treatment of clients. Persons of color may be perceived as pathological regardless of the environmental circumstances, their behavior, for instance, so that oftentimes they're hospitalized or they're imprisoned, disproportionately because of their behavior without recognition of the kinds of things in the environment that leads to the behaviors that are problematic to society, and not trying to not addressing those particular problems, so that the problem continues and continues and continues. If you, Another classic article about the educational system is Jonathan Kozol's article about the schools in East St. Louis and in Long Island, and comparing the two of them. The article's called "Savage Inequalities." And if you've never read that, I encourage you to pull that up on the web and give it a read, because again it demonstrates institutional discrimination, and explains a little bit about how these patterns of oppression are perpetuated in our society. As social workers, we have an ethical obligation to work to eliminate this institutional racism and to enhance our own cultural competence in the process of doing that. So cultural competence isn't necessarily only about race either, as this slide points out. Much more recently, diversity classes and diversity issues itself, also are focusing upon differences in sexual orientation and gender identification, disability, religion, age, different kinds of factors that that speak to differences within our populations. So if you're talking about this on an institutional level and an organizational level, this means not only developing cultural competence among direct line staff, frontline staff, but also, the leadership, the administration of an organization, and their commitment to create the changes necessary, and reviewing policies that underlie this discrimination. There are different strategies for community intervention that are described here, that include locality development, which is really essentially, the worker engages in building relationships within a community and enhancing integration of the community, so that the community is more effective in providing support to each other, certainly, but also in accessing the services and the needs that the community has as a whole. Social action involves action on the part of communities to advocate so that decision makers solve problems identified by the community. Again, that may involve us. It may involve engaging leaders in the community to take part in that social action. I think the more that the community themselves are able to address these problems, and perhaps may only need your support in doing that. It's best to have the community do that advocating. Planning, social planning, which focuses on developing and expanding policies and social services that are to the benefit of the community, and capacity building, which focuses on the increasing the ability of the community to act on its own behalf. So I guess I was identifying that under locality development, but they have it separated out here. There's a 6-phase process that's identified, and there's a particular authors that are mentioned in this. I don't have them in front of me, but the 6-phase process to prepare and address for community concerns. And again, I think this is where this particular format for addressing problems comes up. We identify the need as understood, but here the difference here is the need is identified, understood by the community. So the first thing is, as a worker engaging in social action, go into the community and tell the community what they need to do. You're going to engage the community in identifying what the problems are from their perspective and help them clarify the need and the problems that exist there. Obtain information about that through a systematic process and analyze that information, and then develop and implement a plan of action, and then again, evaluate the outcome and its effects in the end. There are skills that you have to have in order to implement change strategies, as if you're going to organize that and engage individuals yourself in that. And this includes an ability to establish rapport and to be sensitive to diverse populations and their needs. I think this involves not only being open-minded enough to recognize, well, this is where cultural humility comes in, I think, to understand that you have a lot to learn about that diverse population, and a willingness to be able to be open-minded and to learn about them. Again, not telling them, but listening to them. And that's going to help you establish rapport in the process. Know how to demonstrate genuineness and empathy, have effective communication skills, have skills in developing interpersonal relationships, both your relationship with people within that population, as well as encouraging individuals within that diverse community to be able to connect and interact with each other effectively as well. Managing group dynamics, and also other skills like self-awareness, patience, focus, timing. All these kinds of things are important for somebody who's going to engage in community organization. Rivera and Ehrlich, those are the authors I was trying to think of in the last slide, but they talk about the fact that we have these models of community development and organizing, and kind of see it as universal, and they say really it isn't universal. They're not colorblind, and there are factors that should be considered in working with communities of color, for instance, and I think you can apply this and see here I'm talking about it being universal again. What I'm saying is that if the issue is race, or whether the issue is sexual orientation, or whether the issue is disability, I think you can overlay the particular characteristics of the population in each of these three. So the racial, so in working with communities of color, some factors that are to be considered include racial, ethnic, and cultural aspects of the community, that it's different from one group to another. The implications of the uniqueness in particular communities, how for instance, working with the Muslim American community may require a focus on different areas than working with the African American community or a community of disabled individuals. Different processes as well. And then the empowerment process and the developing of a critical consciousness. That critical consciousness, I believe, is them being able to identify themselves as a group and identifying their common needs and wants, and the need to move forward in obtaining those things. Good intentions are not sufficient in community organizings. Consideration, just like you said, just like in individual treatment, race, ethnicity, culture are not secondary considerations, and their criticisms of the community organization models that existed, 20 years ago, was that they tried to be too universal, and that race and ethnicity and culture, and again I would say, the characteristics of any particular population aren't secondary considerations here. Now, this is a chart that comes from the text that talks about what are required of individuals, what are the characteristics that are required of individuals who are intervening, in a community organization effort. Is the individual an outsider who shares the community concerns, or is the individual somebody who has the same racial, cultural, and linguistic background as the community? In each level of characteristics, I think the implication here is this makes you more effective, particularly if you're trying to be instrumental in bringing about change. Then it's more effective the higher up you go among these characteristics. And again, I think this points to the idea that engaging individuals, leaders in the community themselves, in organizing and community and presenting, the needs to the organizations that are being challenged or whatever. It points to the value of engaging individuals from the group itself whenever you can. So you want to ask yourself, when should organizations act on behalf of the community? This means, I think, yourself or your agency. And when is it more advisable for representatives to speak for their community and represent themselves? We as community organizers, as social workers intervening in a social action format, should be observant of the right to self-determination of the individuals in the community, and be sure that the community is informed of and consents to the tactics to be used and understands the risks and benefits. This is informed consent. It's much the same as it would be if you're working with an individual, right? Self-determination and informed consent to principles of our code of ethics. Also, there's some discussion about the use of social media. How do you go about organizing? They say that knocking on the door is one thing, can be very effective, of course, going in, door to door. But also social media is a new way of organizing efforts and things like this. And you see this, I think we see that on a daily basis. And it says here, a focused message that has a direct appeal is essential to recruiting and engaging participants in a change effort. You have to have an effective message. You have to have something that people can connect with, and that that they're willing to, that they can relate to, basically, if you're going to recruit people to work in a change effort. But also understand that the utility of social media is limited by the fact that certain demographic groups aren't going to have ready access to social media. I think this is a good point. It's social media is generational in nature. The younger you are, I think, the more adept at social media and the more comfortable you are with social media and its various forms than the older generation is. And so you want to know who your target population is as to how much you're going to rely on social media. And do communities have the capability to communicate with social media tools? Some communities really don't, as far as internet services are concerned, are very limited, and others have very, very good internet services. But again, may be restricted to only those individuals who can afford it. And so ultimately then, you're going to have to evaluate your intervention in the end, just like in any other things, and it will help in assessing the success of the change effort and the strategies you employed. It's an opportunity for the community to give feedback to you, or the group to give feedback to you about your interventions, and of course for you to learn for future efforts to be involved. And you're collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. And of course, in evaluating this, you want to use the client group to identify what should be an indicator of success and what should be the desired outcome of the change effort, and evaluating whether or not that was achieved. And also, I think, to evaluate their own perceived level of empowerment. How much did they feel they were a part of this process and were effective in bringing about this change? Because the more effective they feel, the more likely they're going to be able to do this again in the future, probably without your services if that were there. And Hepworth talks a little bit about how evaluating macro efforts are more difficult because we tend to measure success with sort of an aggregated client statistical data, and that's probably not the kind of data you're going to get in a social action community organization effort. And they have some different ideas about how to go about measuring change and evaluating the effort that I'm not going to go into here, but they're mentioned in the text, and they do mention that it requires skills in understanding research designing, selecting the proper research design, applying the right measurement techniques, and then analyzing the data. These are skills, again, that you'll get in your research class, not here. So that's it for Hepworth's look at macro practice evaluation, and there are a few other chapters we're going to look at this week, but let me know if you have any questions from this. Thank you.